Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the Acid Left reading group, where we talk about memes as we also speak about a given text we've been reading. So this is Ghosts of My Life. It's part of our Mark Fisher sessions, which will go through all of his published works and his last unfinished introduction to the book, which was to be called something like Acid Communism. And yeah, I'm here again with Ernesto Vargas.
Hello.
Yep, One Dime, the YouTuber, and my regular co-host, Adam Ray Adkins, aka Dirt Son of Earth. And we've been reading, I think, the first 96 pages of Ghosts of My Life. It's a book which was published in 2014 by Zero Books, and it's basically a collection of essays by Mark Fisher. So, essays from his blog K-Punk, also a number from Sight and Sound and The Wire, and I guess a number of other publications. And because it's like a number of essays, it hasn't got like a narrative. I mean, I guess they may have arranged it around some kind of thematics. I mean, the kind of headings suggest so. So there are like headings for different collections of essays. We read basically the first kind of intro chapter, Lost Futures, with two essays. Then there was the first kind of block of essays called Return of the Seventies. So it's a number of essays on the 70s, and they go through different themes. Like next time we'll be addressing hauntology, and the essays in that collection, I think over 2 or 3 sessions, and then the last ones are called The Stain of Place. So I guess more kind of geographic in their orientation. But anyway, they're essays. So, it's not possible to say like capitalist realism, which we discussed recently, that, it has this kind of narrative and it's about this and it suggests this and it's kind of a, it's a remedy for society, or at least it identifies problems for society, and it kind of points to very vaguely some kind of way out. This is more like a series of reflections, each on a topic, as you would expect from a collection of essays, but they're all loosely bound by this theme hauntology, which Fisher talks about in the very beginning of the book, and he refers to Derrida. And actually, we have here our I don't know, we can say our comrade, Codex, who is going to read, as she has read already, the first few chapters from that book, or we're going to play her reading from that book a section on hauntology. So we'll just start with that, and that can kind of work us into the book's themes, and we can look at our memes together.
Derrida coined the term hauntology in his Spectres of Marx, the state of the dead, the work of mourning, and a new international. To haunt does not mean to be present, and it is necessary to introduce haunting into the very construction of the concept, he wrote. Ontology was this concept, or puncept. The pun was on the philosophical concept of ontology, the philosophical study of what can be said to exist. Ontology was the successor to previous concepts of Derrida's, and such as the trace and the difference, like those earlier terms that refer to the way in which nothing enjoys a purely positive existence. Everything that exists is possible only on the basis of a whole series of absences which precede and surround it, allowing it to possess such consistency and intelligibility that it does. In the famous example, any particular linguistic term gains its meaning not from its own positive qualities, but from its difference from other realms. Hence, Derrida's ingenious deconstructions of the metaphysics of the presence and photocentrism, which expose the way in which particular dominant forms of thought had incoherently privileged the voice over writing. But hauntology explicitly brings into play the question of time in a way that had not quite been the case with the trace of difference. Trace or difference. One of the repeated phrases in Spectres of Marx is from Hamlet, "Time is out of joint," and in his recent radical atheism, Derrida and the Time of Life, Mark Hagland, with an umlaut, argues that it is possible to see all of Derrida's work in relation to this concept of broken time. Derrida's aim, Hegland argues, is to formulate a general hauntology, in contrast to the traditional ontology that thinks being in terms of self-identical presence. What is important about the figure of the spectre, then, is that it cannot be fully present. It has no being in itself, but marks a relation to what is no longer or not yet, writes Hegland. Is ontology, then, some attempt to revive the supernatural, or is it just a figure of speech? The way out of this unhelpful opposition is to think of ontology as the agency of the virtual, with the spectre understood not as anything supernatural, but as that which acts without physically existing.
So there we just saw E-Codex presenting hauntology as a basic concept. So the idea that our being is haunted by either the past or the possibilities of the future. So we're not just in the present, we are dealing with histories, or we're dealing with a future which will come about, or perhaps it will never come about, but we're heavily kind of tinged by a possible future. And then what Fisher points to is a kind of problem where this future that we're heading towards, perhaps a communist utopia or some kind of better state, doesn't ever quite arrive, although maybe there are other dystopias that do arrive. So he's kind of heavily caught up in this in this way in which we're never really living in the now, but there seems to be some kind of temporal delay at the same time. So I'm just going to basically find one of his first references was to Sapphire and Steel. Okay, so it's a British TV series that is completely improbable in the current age. So I actually found some of these. I wasn't aware of it before, but it's a series broadcast in the UK from, I think, 1979 to 1982. And it's just very kind of bizarre as a TV program, particularly one on mainstream television, which involves these kind of detectives of time which go around. It's not really clear from the series actually even what they are or what they do or where they come from, but they are kind of time detectives that may be from a different planet or maybe from a different time. But what they do is they come and they arrive and they solve mysteries or some kind of occurrences around the flow of temporality. And what happens is there are kind of gaps in time, or there are gaps through which time can kind of escape, and this causes terrible problems. So they arrive in a house with these two kids who've just lost their parents because their parents have literally disappeared into like a time void, and they're just like these very scary people, from a kid's perspective, but from the audience's perspective as well, called Sapphire and Steel. Sapphire, this woman, and Steel, this guy. And the kind of subtext is maybe they literally are, they're made of the elements sapphire and steel. And I want to just show you some of this to see what Fisher's talking about, because he's just kind of like very amazed that this TV program could happen at all in reflection, although it's something from his teens. I'm just looking where I put it. Okay, here. And he's talking about how these kind of space detectives or time detectives, as they end up in this cafe at the end, and we'll just see kind of what happens to them and what Fisher inferred from this. Okay, so as a quick interlude here, what we see there in the end of Sapphire and Steel and what Fisher actually describes is these people here basically in a cafe. They are kind of time detectives, and they've been somehow trapped by I guess bad guys, and they get told that you are stuck in time, or rather you're in no time and no place. So you're basically stuck in this cafe for eternity. Then you see the camera pull away, and you see them in this cafe through this window, and all you see is a window traveling through space, and them looking like they're gradually realizing that they're stuck in this god awful cafe for eternity. So that's basically what we would be seeing now. You can Google that if you Google the last episode of Sapphire and Steel, but we got blocked showing that to you by YouTube. So I just made this little segment which I'm recutting into the reading group, which will restart now. Okay, so that's the very end of the series, and Fisher kind of likens that fate of the time detectives to our own fate as being trapped in nowhere and no time, like them in that cafe, which kind of stands, outside time and geography. And I mean, if you're English, the really striking thing is that it involves, you see here, Joanna Lumley, the actress, who is best known for Absolutely Fabulous. I don't know if anyone knows this, who's not British. The series
right.
Absolutely Fabulous. Yeah. Okay, so maybe I don't need to show you any of that. In that chapter, there's a lot of kind of talk about a lost past, but then you get the feeling that in the end, there's some kind of moment of triumph when it talks about Tricky, the working class kid who made it big, and actually now I can produce one of my memes. So he talks about Tricky, and there's this line in Tricky, they used to call me Tricky Kid, now they call me Superstar, which is about Tricky's rise to fame. And this is just quite a silly meme. I don't know how well it even works, but they used to call me K-Punk, now they call me Super Czar. And I found, like I said, I found, I don't know how I came across this, but on the internet, a story of a czar-sized bed, which was called like Bed Made for a Czar. Actually, I didn't read the whole story, but I think basically it just relates to the bed being designed for a Russian czar. And I just kind of related immediately when I read about this Tricky coming from working class roots, having a really tough time growing up, being raised by, I think, women from his house. I don't remember if it was his mum and his aunt or what exactly, his aunt and his grandma, but he was raised by women in difficult circumstances in the sense that they had no money. And then he made it big. But then Mark Fisher says, this thing of Tricky saying, they used to call me Tricky Kid, i.e. a kid with problems. Now they call me Superstar, is kind of tinged with anger or a kind of critique of the star system, because it's like, why particularly does he have to be a star? What's good about being a star? And that's the whole thing about capitalism kind of bollocksing up, or rather ruining culture, that, if one is really good, then they end up becoming basically sold off by the system and kind of fucked up by that experience. Then you think about Fisher and his fate, and actually the book is kind of shot through with these examples of stories of suicide and depression without any cure, which makes it kind of difficult to read on reflection, considering Fisher committed suicide. But amongst all that, one can't help kind of seeing also the rise of Fisher, from a guy who had a blog who couldn't really get a job at a uni, to getting a job at a goldsmith, but then killing himself not much later than that. But then just becoming even, much more famous subsequently after he died. And a lot of this being through memes. So there's all these kind of people who know who he is, but haven't even read his quite short books, because they've seen him on memes, etc. And one of the memes that's going around is a Mark Fisher bed, but not as big as this. But there are various versions of beds with Mark Fisher's capitalist realism as the bedspread.
Right. Yeah.
So I just use that kind of like, because I find this whole Mark Fisher meme tendency quite cringeworthy, just because some of the statements made about him ignore that he was quite uncomfortable with his own fame, even in his lifetime when he wasn't that famous. But he would have just found quite horrible the way he's become a commodity, as a meme, because memes feed the data economy.
Oh, so we're getting into this meme?
Yeah, it's showing, yeah.
Okay. Well, so there's many. So I guess before I just explain this, so what is ontology? Well, ontology is, vaguely speaking, is this view of reality, view of existence. Haunt, can take the word haunt, ghosts, essentially. We have like a nostalgic view of the past in which things from the past, but in very scattered forms, sort of resurrect themselves into our current cultural time. And part of this is sort of why Fisher argues, and you could say to an extent Jameson, who he borrows a lot from, Frederick Jameson, is that we don't really have a lot of things that define our current age. So what really defines the 2000s? There's less and less unique things, not in the technological sense, but in the cultural sense. And more so, we have weird amalgamations, resurrections of things in the past into a weird nostalgia that defines our present. But yeah, if we want to get into this particular quote, I decided to touch on this quote involving social democracy because I had a quote from Capitalist Realism in the last reading group involving that. And one thing that is interesting to me, so let's read the quote, is when Fisher says, "Perhaps it is useful to remind ourselves here that social democracy has only become a resolved totality in retrospect. At the time, it was a compromise formation, which those on the left saw as a temporary bridgehead from which further gains could be won. What should haunt us is not no longer of actually existing social democracy, but the not yet of the futures that popular modernism trained us to expect, which never materialized." So what's interesting here is what defines the left a lot of the time, well now especially, but it's supposedly the far left, is just social democracy. And that is really interesting to me because you find a lot of who are the icons of the left and who I kind of highlight in the meme here. So Naomi Klein, very iconic figure of the left in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, still to an extent today. Chris Hedges in the bottom left-hand corner. Ralph Nader on the bottom right-hand corner, who is once considered the outcast, the dark horse of American politics, but was really just proposing a form of social democracy, which was, I would say, a slightly more radical version of Franklin Roosevelt, New Deal social democracy. That's why he's behind him. And I guess you could say also Clement Attlee, he's also there because that is, I guess you could say, the golden age of British social democracy. There's a big nostalgia for that. And you can see that also reflected in Adam Curtis films too, who is one of my favorite left-wing, I guess you could say, mainstream directors, documentary directors. He's really brilliant. But I do think his politics sort of have this nostalgia for social democracy, in which things were so much better in the past. And that's sort of, we don't know what to return to. I feel like the left doesn't know what to return to, so we sort of exaggerate, or we have a nostalgia that looks a lot more fondly on social democracy than it actually is. And that's one thing Fisher is kind of criticizing. And there's other parts in this segment, but I only included a small bit, was social democracy was actually quite bureaucratic. And it wasn't a totality, it's just a compromise. It's not something that is a political position in and of itself, but something we just settled for. And the only reason why we really see it as so great, and why the wider political sphere sees it as the radical left, is because it looks like a totality in comparison to the absolutely dystopian neoliberal politics we have now, right? So that is a theme, I guess you could say, of hauntology, but applied specifically to politics. In fact, what the left is proposing now, Green New Deal, universal healthcare in the United States, a higher minimum wage, affordable housing plan. These aren't radical ideas whatsoever at all. They're really not even a totality in the history of left politics. I mean, I think Lenin was calling, so I'm not saying we're going to have problems with Lenin, but Lenin would call social democrats social fascists. And anarchists didn't like social democrats back in the day either. They were seen as an enemy. But now, because in comparison to what we have now, this old idea of social democracy is resurrected, and what makes up the left. There's a lack of unique ideas on the front. And you could say Corbyn is an improvement from social democracy, a more robust, Trotskyist kind, I guess. But it is interesting to me that we look so fondly on that, on social democracy, and that's what defines our left. The icons here on the screen what have that. And I think it is a product of hauntology, because the radicality of social democracy is not reflected in history. It's sort of like, it's a nostalgia. Anyone else have anything to touch on?
Yeah. Okay. Cool. I'm unmuted. Yeah. I think I see what you're saying there. One time for sure. So I think we've gotten a little bit way ahead, like you were kind of getting at with trying to define hauntology there. It's a really, there's a lot of different hauntological modes that he talks about in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you're getting at here is also that there's positive and negative versions of this. There is a very positive hauntology. And directly relating to your meme, it's what should haunt us is not the no longer of actually existing social democracy, but the not yet of the futures that popular modernism trained us to expect. They never materialize, so they still haunt us as not present. Because the hauntology refers so directly to this lost future, which is, what he tries to illustrate visually with the sapphire and steel reference that Mike plays at the beginning, this meshing of times together. I don't think it's at all really a judgment on repeating the past in the direct sense of, oh, you're just redoing something over again. It's the inability to get beyond what's already been done, the inability for newness itself. It's very similar to what he's saying in capitalist realism, but he's giving it another dimension where it reaches further, not just in this canceling event, where you can see the non-materialized can actually be very positive. And what's the other? So yeah, he also says like that the hauntology allows us to choose not between a world of internet and social security, but one where like that choice doesn't even, make a difference. We're not trying to go back to the old times because the new times suck. We're saying that in the new times, what was promised in the past that looked to redeem itself has not come. So that's a really important factor there.
That's what he's saying. That's not what should haunt us. So what should haunt us is the not materialized. But what is haunting us partially is also that nostalgia for what was looked at as a totality. What is looked at as a totality, which fundamentally isn't. That social democracy. But yeah, as you're clarifying, is what we should be more looking past on is the fact that what should be an advancement from social democracy, an improvement, was never materialized, and that we should be looking towards a future. But at the same time, the future is increasingly harder to imagine.
Right.
I see that's where I would say acid communism kind of ties in, because that in itself is sort of a hauntology, because it's looking at 1960s, 70s culture, psychedelics culture, and he's seeing that, well, obviously this kind of failed, but there's potential in this. So at least if we can't imagine new futures, at least we can realize the potentials of something that maybe had potential.
Yes. It definitely ties in there. I don't know, you see a big through, I think, with Fisher's work as I'm reading it more systematically. I see that line going through there. It is that. So the nostalgia is interesting too, because it's not nostalgia itself that's bad by any means. It's this idea of creating an eternal time that lasts, just like that's illustrated in the Sapphire and Steel. It's that the 80s are being reproduced in a way that creates a false 80s that is then redone. It's not the actuality of the 80s or the 70s. It's what Jameson calls the nostalgic mode. And you're just creating that eternally, and it becomes this glossed over thing without the actual textuality of that time period that made it interesting, or that Fisher saw interesting, at least. Not having lived in those time periods myself, it is kind of hard to say, but you can think about it now with the 90s for me growing up. And also the interesting or important thing that he touches on too is that when we say the future is canceled or there's a slow cancellation of the future, he gets that from Bifo Berardi, and it is precisely the psychological ability to conceive of something different that is slowly being canceled. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the future itself continues, technology continues, but it's the imagination part which both connects it to capitalist realism and acid communism.
I don't want to bring this off track, but there's like a theme that perfectly ties into this, because I feel Baudrillard says something very similar to what Fisher is saying about imagining the future, which seemingly, I haven't read any Berardi, but I guess Fisher gets this from him. But when Baudrillard famously talks about reality disappearing, he's not talking about reality obviously physically, but metaphysically, and that's not because of reality. Nothing is real in the sense that we might think. It's more that we have too much reality. Everything is realized, digitized, mediatized, made into the image, and there's no room as a result for illusion. Illusion here being imagination, reversibility. So that's why we're kind of entering what Baudrillard calls a non-conflictual reality. We can't imagine alternative. And I see that as very similar here, because it's not like the future is going on. You see many technological progressions. Things are changing more rapidly, in fact. But what's weird is everything is changing, but at the same time, culturally, nothing is seeming to change. Right. Which is weird, because there isn't a reversibility. And I think he has on his lecture called No Time, Mark Fisher's lecture. He talks about that too.
Yeah, if I can just come in, because I suppose that's what I was getting at partly, is that there's this kind of talk about inertia again and again, and nothing changing. But it doesn't really hold up for me, because things do change. We have like a coming back of the past. So, there are characteristics of the Trump movement, which kind of reflect fascist era politics. I mean of the 1920s and 1920s and 1930s or 40s. And you see that also in Brexit, but it's not the same thing. It's a bit different, no? And people don't seem to have much problem saying, well, hang on, Trump isn't exactly the same as fascism. But people at the same time go, oh, there's nothing new in music. And there's no new music. But there is new right-wing populism. And I think the thing is, it's kind of a natural human negative tendency, particularly anyway of the left or sensitive people, to go like, oh, there's nothing good anymore. But there are new shit things. I just doesn't really hold up, and that's where it comes through in glimmers with Fisher, getting really excited about things which are new when he's writing about them, they're certainly a very novel presentation of existing kind of musical tropes. Like you can't say Goldie or Tricky, didn't feel very new at the time in the 90s. And this whole
he highlights them as positive things.
Well, yeah, that's what I thought as well.
That's the thing. That's what I mean. But that's why I say there are things that I say glimpses that come through. These things come through, but they seem to run up against his kind of general.
What I thought Fisher's kind of argument is that jungle was the last, or if not one of the last forms of new cultural innovative time. Because he says he seemed to really be looking at the 2000s as a lost decade of lack of. Okay, I can get this, but then that's all very good if you were like, what is he like? 1968? Was he born 67? But he's it does sound like a kind of boomerish argument. There's some truth to it, I think.
At this point, most of his references can't be understood by people much younger than the 50s now, and he's basically saying. Somewhere in his 40s, he was saying that the cutoff point is now, or the best it got was some point in my early 30s, and it stopped being good. Mm-hmm. I think there is a case to say now, well, hang on, that's not really true, because otherwise you're basically saying to anybody who's growing up now, there's just no hope for you. It won't ever be good. The last point it was ever good, very coincidentally, the last time that Mark Fisher went clubbing. doesn't really hold true entirely. But I can see, I can see how it would happen that you would say that, and I think I struggle a bit to find good new things happening. But
well, it can be an age bias, because he does cite Jameson, who makes the very bold claim that Star Wars was actually just a repetition of past archetypes, but using new technological cinematic tools. So it was like really cool, like CGI. But he said that really, like, Star Wars is the same themes, and I think that's an argument a lot of people would disagree with.
I mean, he does say something about the possibility of a kind of positive nostalgia, and he calls it the Madeleine moment. And he says after Proust and somebody else who used the same term, I can't remember, but there's this Madeleine in, or however you say this, Madeleine in Proust. Isn't this like a type of biscuit that the character in Proust was eating, and the taste took him back to his childhood? It's a very famous moment in literature. But he says the thing about that moment is it's completely uncorrupted by capital, in the way that capital kind of morphs and then resells the past. So like the Madeleine moment is like a psychological phenomenon, basically, where you can eat or smell something and it takes you back to some moment in the past, but it's very personal. And what he's basically saying, maybe I'll find it for you. How do you spell this Madeleine? Oh yeah, this is on page 77. It says the icon is a very hang on, look out. He says everything is so iconic, talking about like certain tropes of the 70s, or not really tropes, but fashion icons and things. So he says open university lecturers with preposterous moustaches and voluminous collars. So these people on TV with these crazy clothes, everything is so iconic. And the thing with icons, after all, is that they evoke nothing. The icon is the very opposite of the Madeleine. Chris Marker's name, following Hitchcock and Proust, for those totemic triggers that suddenly abduct you into the past. So what he's saying is, I suppose he's saying that style icons don't last, whereas there are kind of personalized moments which can port you properly into the past. But they only manage this because they avoid museumification. They avoid being archived basically in museums. So he's saying like the fashion of the 70s, it can't withstand being archived and therefore being institutionalized and therefore then being ruined by capitalism, basically. They're not like this very personal psychological process of being ported into the past through a taste or a smell or something. Okay, I see what he means. I suppose. But for me, it's like, anyway, the very personal experience of like eating something and being ported back to when you were a childhood is always more about now than about, about that time when you were 5 and you ate your favorite, cookie or whatever. It's more about now. So I don't see why we have to feel deprived in the now. It's just if capitalism has basically bastardized a lot of what was good about the 70s, it still remains that all that stuff, as we're experiencing it now, is something that we ultimately have to feel control over. That if you're saying that stuff can't be experienced now in any positive sense because it's been basically co-opted by capital, as opposed to your personalized experience relating to the particular taste of a biscuit you had when you were 5. The thing is, both those things, the taste of the biscuit that ports you back to being 5 and you listening to 70s music now, are basically being refracted through your sensory apparatus and your brain's relation to them. So surely it has a lot to do with how we cope with this and how we claim those experiences for ourselves. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
In which case, the whole thing of culture always being ruined by capital is something we can only really confront by reclaiming it for ourselves. You know what I mean? Is that we have to be on top of this ourselves.
Yeah.
So you know, Mark Fisher's deep malaise in relation to the past and sadness of it having passed, you know, being distant, and we can't re-grasp it in its original form, has much more to do with Mark Fisher than, you know.
Well, I think you're right there that it could have a lot to do with Fisher himself.
Well, I think we have to be aware that also. Sorry, Adam, because I think I leave myself open there to be misinterpreted. Of course, it's also to do with capitalism, but I only mean in the interest of finding some way, you know, around what Fisher describes as being purely negative. You know, we need to kind of imagine ourselves as able to somehow process this differently and find positivity in it. Okay, that's the last thing I was going to say.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not so sure I think he's actually even saying something that it's not even saying that it's capital there, that it's more about the way those things develop, and that what becomes to be iconic is only a symbol that doesn't actually, like I said earlier, like represent the textuality of that moment. Whereas like, yeah, the personal thing, like the cookie will do that. But I want to, in Fisher's own defense, though, you know, he kind of says this about himself in the book. He's like, well, maybe, you know, what I'm talking about here is only the old person doesn't like the new thing. But then he counters that and says, but really what I'm shocked at is that I don't see the new thing, that I see the repeating. You know, it's kind of a sadness of not being disgusted at the new culture, that there's not something that he's saying, oh my God, this is noise. Why is this being played? Who could possibly listen to this? It's like the fact that everything seems so accessible that the new things there aren't disgusting to him is what's disgusting. And, you know, because he talks about, when one time mentioned the Star Wars thing, he contrasts that with craft work. So the way that the technology in Star Wars allowed them to retell an old story, but with new stuff, versus the technology like synthesizers and computer technology that Kraftwerk was experimenting with, allowed them not to recreate old songs, but to come up with something that challenged what music itself sounded like. So not just like higher definitions or funky, you know, sounds, but something that people, you know, Jerry Lee Lewis would have been like, that is not music. So I think there is a difference, and it straddles, and maybe he doesn't always follow through, and maybe he does go back to the to what we're describing, but I think his goal is not to do that. So I guess, yeah, that's what y'all are saying a little bit, is you feel like he doesn't achieve that goal so much sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I can't really blame him. Go on, sorry.
I do feel that he claims to it every now and then. Earlier, he talks about specifically types of melancholy, right? Mm-hmm. And I thought it was very important to make that specific distinction, that the left needs to engage not with melancholy, but rather with mourning, right? We have to pass a mourning process. We have to let the ghosts go rather than to keep being satisfied with the satisfaction, right? Which is why Fisher, you know, brings back Lacan.
This Adam's cockatiels in the background there, for anyone who wants to know. Adam has a number of birds that are tweeting there, which is fine. But the customers, how do I say that? The customers, the viewers may demand the refund or something. No, the viewers may wonder what's happening there.
And there's my meme. So if you want, I can give the quote that's behind the meme, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So Fisher's talking about Life on Mars, the 1973 cop show. He says that Sam Tyler became the bad conscience of the 70s cop show, whose discontent with the past permitted us to enjoy it again. Sam, as the modern, enlightened good cop, was less the antitype of antediluvian bad cop Gene Hunt than the postmodern disavowal which made possible our enjoyment of Hunt's invective, and violence, right? So that's the text in the background. And the image we're using here is Ted Cruz, right? But not just any Ted Cruz, but punished Ted Cruz from Metal Gear Solid 5, right? So I read recently an article on Cruz a little bit after the Capitol riots. And so I pulled this quote from it. The biggest conversation I've had with fellow Cruz supporters is, was he always this way or did he change? Right? And it feels sometimes that, and I think I think we all were a little bit frustrated with the fact that Fisher just goes on and on about very personal stuff, like in terms of taste and culture, right? Like TV shows that might even be a little bit inaccessible, and so on. And so when we're talking, and you, Mike, you say, I think it's more about Fisher than about society, right? And I agree with that point. I think
can I just say that when I say that,
Yeah.
I think it's also about many people, if they feel depressed, and I felt depressed in my life as well. So I'm not particularly like dissing Mark Fisher for that. I'm just saying that there is that experience, but we have to be conscious that there's also a way out as well. That Fisher wasn't fortunate enough to be able to take, and that's kind of that. That's obviously tragic, but just putting forward there that this isn't the only way of looking at stuff.
Yeah. That's my point. My point is that Fisher's perspective is maybe a bit too familiar, right? It might be personal to him, but I think it's in its particularity, it is quite universal, right? To draw some Hegelian terms. And that's why I thought about Ted Cruz, because he was just a stooge, right? He was a stooge for the Republicans, he was a stooge for Trump, and he was a stooge for the voters as well, which is why I made the comparison with Life on Mars, right? Sam Tyler, the character, who by the way, this is one of the only pop culture references from this book that I actually knew from beforehand. And the whole reason why I knew is actually contrary to Fisher's own taste, because how he goes on about Doctor Who at some point, and he says, yeah, I didn't like the newest shows because they were too studio-y and so on, right? I actually watched those shows, and John Sim, I think is the name of the actor, he's on both, right? He's on Doctor Who and on Life on Mars. And I was exposed to Life on Mars, through the new series of Doctor Who. So I think it's interesting how, despite Fisher having this particular block, subjective block to engaging with this culture, it still remained accessible for some of us in a different context, right? But anyway, that personal aside, this whole thing about having a good cop as a place that we can occupy subjectively, right? From where we can judge and from where we can disavow violence, I think it turns out to be quite convenient at times. And I'm doing the example with Cruz here because he is being the bad cop right now for Republicans, right? He's being the bad Republican, the one that was complicit and the one that was violent, right? So he's the punished one now, not us.
Yep.
Someone rang my door.
Don't worry, Dan.
Okay. Yeah, certainly Ted Cruz is going a funny direction. Yeah, he really he does look like this kind of pirate, or this. He's just so bizarre. I saw him with a black face mask yesterday going into the Senate, and he was being asked a question, and he's kind of the way he was talking back to the reporter. He's like this kind of like evil hipster. I don't know how it came about. He was just this massive geek before.
Yeah. Ted Cruz is quite the character. I agree.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what happened to him. Was it like an actual event that turned him? I mean, apart from him just losing the.
It was Trump calling his wife ugly.
Right. Yeah.
Lion Ted.
Yeah.
I mean, the kind of change in style, complete change in persona and style that you only normally get, in your 20s.
Mm-hmm.
or as teenagers have it, but as adults, you only really have this happen some point in your 20s. It's just bizarre that somebody his age and like in his position of responsibility will just suddenly like, become like evil hipster guy. It's like he's watched a film and he decided that he wants to be the main character, like kids do.
Yeah. He has a nice beard though.
Maybe he's embracing the image people have of him already. Like he just looks like a scumbag. And so
yeah. So actually, Ernesto, you actually pushed me closer to y'all's side of your critiques of Fisher. Because I really disagreed with him about the Doctor Who. Because I think he's talking about the David Tennant or the Christopher Eccleston one.
Yes.
Those are amazing.
Yeah, exactly.
I've never seen the Life on Mars. I just looked it up when you said that, and I see. So the guy that plays Sam Tyler is the guy that plays the Master in Doctor Who, and he is an amazing villain in that. So I actually want to watch Life on Mars now.
Great.
Yeah, but I mean, good meme. I'm trying to think where to go from here. Adam, did you have any memes?
Yes, I sent them to you. I emailed them to you.
But on what email? In what dimension?
I sent you the Google Drive. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, but
okay.
I mean, just to my Drive. Did you tell me you? Oh, hang on.
No, I didn't tell you. No, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
I just sent it.
Yeah. Okay. I'll find them now. Let me think.
I have a few in there, and I struggled with not creating 100 memes for this. But funny enough, most of them that I really wanted to do came from those first two chapters, those first two essays, Lost Futures and Ghost of My Life. And I think in those two, because I'm trying to think of how the structure of this really works, even though I know it's pieced together essays, what the point is. And it seems like he's really laying out his ideas in those, and then those individual essays are just like driving the point in more and more, kind of like giving fine details to what he's saying, or serving as examples to the essays. And okay, so this one I thought was a great little thing for ontology. And it says, ontology is the agency of the virtual. The specter is not supernatural. It is that which acts without physically existing. And I mean, I guess that kind of speaks for itself, but it also shows like the very thing that he's talking about and what ontology really is and how it exists within us. It's really highlighting this virtual part of it, the way that we interact with media today and the way that ideas are represented to us. The example of the icon, operates in that same way, even though he's speaking of it kind of negatively there. It's that it's always there. It's that when you think back of the 70s, you think of the iconic 70s fashion. When you think back to the 50s, you think of these specific things that represent it forever in this virtual sense, rather than the lived experience of those times. So like, if we're going to the 50s, Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley, they are of course iconic figures, but they take away aspects of, other music at the time. Specifically, you could say like, Elvis is erasing the black people that actually wrote most of his music at that time. But also like, the poor life that a lot of people experience. We have these images that persist, the 1950s housewife and that family, which, we've talked about this before on the capitalist realism one. Yeah, that's a moment. It's a little section, but that's not the everyday life for people. There's a lots of other stuff there. This one I thought was interesting too. So it's speed is a connectivity drug, making sense of a world with increasing electronic connections, but the come down is vicious. And then it says massive serotonin depletion, energy crash, turn on your TV, turn down your pulse, turn away from it all, it's all getting too much. And that part really stood out to me in the book because, of course, visually, it's kind of represented like that, almost like a poem in a sense, like he's having a bit of a breakdown while writing it. So it sticks out. But this is the other thing I think is actually really insightful with this book, and maybe is harder to parse out of Fisher's writing on its own, unless you're really keeping in mind the like Jameson influence there, is that it is connected to a materiality of sorts, and it is connected to the lived experience of people. So speed becomes so, yeah, right there in the book. You know, speed became so big in the 80s precisely at a time when connections to people, you know, when mass media was really starting to overwhelm the senses of everyday people. And, you know, and then he doesn't go on to this, but I think you could think about it too. Like, I know growing up, methamphetamine became really big in the time that internet life was actually really dominating everything. And these aren't causal. I'm not trying to say like that's actually the reason why people would go out and do cocaine, is because there were more TV channels or anything like that. But that there is something relating there, these moments of expression, these moments of consumption, and like the actual material forces of our lives at that time. And then, you know, who we've talked with, Brian Francis Culkin on the podcast with before, about also the relation of like heroin and opiate use past the 2008 financial crash, you know. So there is those kind of moments there. And I thought it was interesting that he's connecting speed there. Because he also talks about that with jungle music, you know, speed and jungle music kind of go hand in hand, or jungle offers a alternative to speed, where it kind of, you know, if you're listening to jungle at a rave, you're kind of experiencing a neurological different mode of existing, even if you haven't snorted coke or ecstasy that night. This one, I'm actually only very vaguely familiar with this meme, but apparently it's really big in the UK. I don't know if y'all have seen it, but it's the four lads in jeans. And I quoted here, so I put Ian Curtis of Joy Division over one and said, "For the truth of Joy Division is that if they were lads, then Joy Division must also be the truth of laddism." And I just thought that was a good quote and a funny quote, because he's also, again, with that same concept. It's he's there articulating the people who say, well, Joy Division really were either psychotic, depressive people, or, oh, don't you know, I knew Ian Curtis. He was actually so fun to hang out with. We all had fun. You know, the guys from New Order are great. They're lads, you know, they're just boys hanging out. That's just what it is. And Fisher's kind of saying, well, they can be both of those things, right? Like if these are just guys having fun, goofing off, you know, doing their thing, then you also have to look at that deep depression that they represent and say that itself is representing a part of what it means to be a lad in that time period. So here you can see like these guys also represent, maybe they're just lads out on the town having some beers or whatever, but their menacingness also represents a certain part of like masculine culture today. I don't know how else to expand on that. I think it's self-evident.
Seeing coming across these four people, I can't see the fourth one, but I think, you know, coming across these people would be just quite terrifying. I don't know.
Right?
Are they English or are they American? I don't know. But if they were English, I think I would find them terrifying.
They look English.
But anyhow, but the thing is, there's a strange thing. I can quite see where Fisher's coming from, also because there was a kind of phenomenon, I guess, in the early 2000s where kind of Britpop culture and a kind of a grungy culture as well, but more Britpop, suddenly became kind of quite mainstream. So you go to a pub and you think, oh yeah, looks like there's some all right people here. Then people just start punching each other, and you realise you know, the typical kind of lads you were always trying to avoid. So there is that kind of side that laddism has its kind of There is. I don't think there wasn't really a lad element in Britpop culture or in kind of rock and roll culture. It was actually that just infected the mainstream, so you couldn't tell anymore. But anyhow, it's true that in any case there is this lad culture that kind of underlies other cultures, like grunge culture and metal culture and et cetera, et cetera. I remember Kurt Cobain always getting really angry because there'd be the kind of people turning up and moshing at Nirvana gigs, who he had particularly he had specifically written about. His songs were about them. Like, he's the one who knows all the songs. What's that? He's the one. Oh, we're not going to sing.
Who knows all knows the words to all our songs.
And he likes to sing along, but he knows not what it means or something.
Yeah.
And then he had exactly the people he was speaking about there turning up in droves after that. And I remember Smells Like Teen Spirit when that came on in clubs in the kind of just before the mid-90s, and I was going to clubs like young because I could get in. And I had older brothers, and like when Smells Like Teen Spirit came on, like everyone's beers would fly in the air, and then people would just start jumping on each other and punching each other. It'd just be completely wild. So I think there's always been a bit of that problem, because not everyone like in rock culture is Kurt Cobain. There's a heck of a lot of them are your normal kind of weirdos.
And it's and he don't know what it means when I say which is like operates both as the just in a song people say and it's like a filler word, but also in Nirvana's music and a lot of that grunge, when you actually hear those people say those even in that very song, it's like it's a sign of exhaustion. It's like the that's in there, the voice that says it is very defeated and very sick of the world, precisely against the people, the as REM would call them, the shiny happy people that would be moshing along and just out for a laugh or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's what Kurt Cobain kind of summed up very well in many lyrics and things. And even Dave Grohl seems like a total, like, just general lad guy. Plays guitar as well.
He does.
He drums, but he seems like just a lad who drums. But didn't he end up like saying something really wrong? So it was not.
This I don't know.
Woke. I don't know. He got. I guess it was not woke. Not that I'm woke, but whatever he said was very much not woke. And I don't know. Anyway, he was in trouble a couple of years ago. Maybe none of us followed it.
No, I only liked Foo Fighters so. They're just whatever. They have some good songs, but I was a really big Nirvana fan, especially in like high school and stuff, which was after Kurt had passed, but it spoke to me. And that's the other thing is, I think the best essay in here in that first section, the Return of the 70s, past the intros, is the Joy Division one to me. And maybe it is because I've struggled with a lot of those mental health issues personally. But man, the way he describes depression, without getting into it, because it is sad, because we know Fisher's fate, it really is some of the greatest description of what it actually feels like to be going through a depressive episode. Now moving on.
Yeah, but I also think it's very clear when someone's been writing when they're either depressed or anxious, or that particular line that you showed me. Sorry, you showed us in the meme when he suddenly writes like this to describe what it's like being on speed. Yeah, but I did kind of think I know exactly what you mean, but I also thought this is kind of horrible because I know what you mean, and because I probably would have thrown away all my writing that I did when I was in that state afterwards. There's something to be said for people writing when they're highly emotional, and most of these essays do seem a bit like he's speeding, or they're much more emotive than capitalist realism.
Yeah, for sure. They definitely are. They're more connected to psychological states, which is interesting because, he started trying to talk about psychological states in capitalist realism. But I think for me, he's doing it better here because it is more emotive. So here we have one, it's from closer to the beginning of the book, and this is something that also, like I was saying before, I think it's kind of lost unless you're really looking at it through a certain lens or trying to pick it up, is that there's a material here. There's part of this that this moment, these feelings don't come out of nowhere. They come from the way we experience things. So it says, thanks to VHS, DVD, and YouTube, everything was available for rewatching. In the conditions of digital recall, loss itself is loss. And so that's one of the ways that they keep going and going, and you don't actually get to have your own form of like personal nostalgia or like psychological nostalgia with them, because they can be recalled at any time. And like we were able to watch Sapphire and Steel, something none of us had even seen before. So, you know, that wasn't lost on us. And we're increasingly experiencing that lack of loss, you know, able to constantly be able to review things, constantly be able to look at them again and again. And, you know, the definition might get jacked up and, you know, you can uncover things. And sometimes that makes it better. Sometimes that ruins the experience. You know, there's a H. Bomber guy had a video of the scan line about VHSs, which was actually really good about this, which talked about the way the Alien VHS, how much scarier it is than the DVD, because the DVD boosts the definition of it and lightens up all these areas. So whereas before you're experiencing it in a way that you're not quite sure, oh, is there an alien over there? Everything's so dark. In the newer version that's high def, you can clearly see down every hallway. You know there's no alien there. So it's I've always really liked that example that he gave there. But also, in case anyone didn't notice, this meme is a bit silly in that it is the Lost meme. If you don't know what that is, you can look it up. But it's a very popular meme format of a webcomic, like a stupid webcomic that ends up one of the characters dies or has a miscarriage. Is that what it is, Ernesto?
Yes, that is
miscarriage. Yeah. And so like that's the pattern is like one smaller, two equal, one laying down. And so like you'll see that reflected in memes all the time as a hidden meme within itself. And then of course you got like old TVs there, kind of harkening back to this digital version or this ability to be able to recall old things over and over again. But the TVs are actually old and decrepit and you wouldn't use them anymore.
Okay. A good way to end. I don't know, anyone who's tried streaming will find like all kinds of glitches and technical loss, like somehow kind of getting thrown in the mix. But yeah, I understand the context. Loss in that sense. Sorry?
There is something I definitely want to add because it's so relevant. Is regarding the 2000s, nothing being defining the 2000s, nothing new. There's actually a highly popular YouTube series about this, but it obviously doesn't look at it from a theoretical context using ontology, but it's more like just an intuitive way. But it's by the channel Knowledge Hub, and it's called, one video is called Nothing Defines the 2000s, and one called Nothing Defines the 2010s. And it kind of analyzes a bit why, and one of the arguments they make is the profusion of content. Partly, like the digital profusion, like over influx of everything. Kind of everything just gets intermixed and mashed together. And also, arguably, they kind of go at it, but they don't really, it's not a very in-depth analysis. But when I was watching their video, I couldn't help but think of what I had heard at the time of ontology. And reading this is kind of clearing things up a little bit. So really, it's also, yeah, there's the digital element. So I guess you could say that's a materialist analysis of possibly maybe why this is, or if that's even the case, that there's nothing that defines it. I think regardless, one can argue that it is harder to pinpoint what defines the 2000s and 2010s. And it is hard to, because looking at the 2000s, okay, we're still looking at the 2000s, it is hard to really see what culturally was defining of that. Even it's hard, I would say it's hard for the 90s to an extent, but even stranger for the 2000s. But so yeah, there's the materialist aspect, could be digital culture is an impacting that. But I would say also maybe culturally, as Fisher and Jameson note, neoliberalism being sort of the world order, leaving no room for reversibility, there's not a, before it was like the Soviet Union versus the United States, there's a case to be made for capitalism, whereas now capitalism just is, it's totalizing reality. It just is that there isn't any real political conflicts. And if anything, you see like the real conflicts we have over time is, you were saying, Mike, sort of our recycled versions of previous, they're new, but they're really recycled. Like as in Trump's populism is, I would even say it's recycled fascism. I would say it's a parody of fascism, frankly, like a parody of fascism, or pastiche of fascism, maybe a better word here. But yeah, the fact that there isn't really any changes fundamentally in the ruling ideology, there isn't really a reversibility, isn't a conflict. It's neoliberalism fundamentally, and I say Trump, despite his rhetoric being sort of, kind of fascist characteristics, ultimately is neoliberal in his governance, of like very similar to that of Obama. Now you have Biden. There isn't real political conflict. There isn't real big socio-political. Well, I don't want to say there isn't big socio-political changes, but if you look at it, it is not the same as the Cold War. It's not the same. You could say we have a new Cold War now with China, but that's really just capitalism versus capitalism. It's not a real, there's not a real ideological conflict. We're sort of in a circular stagnation of the same. While things technologically progressing, but so you could say the socio-political element and the material element to contribute to this lack of things that define our culture. Because if you see that culture is a reflection of all these things I just mentioned, then yeah, it's going to reflect something pretty unchanging. It's not going to be. It's you could say 60s culture reflected a certain change of desire, a certain change of a new generation, whereas, and to an extent, 80s culture too, 80s culture with yuppie culture and whatnot, sort of the also new emerging digitization. But what is that change now of the 2000s? And can we observe that in cultural forms? And I think it's increasingly hard. If anyone can pinpoint to maybe what that could be, that'd be interesting.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I think there was a very strong new virulent form of racism and sexism that's grown up in recent years, and they're kind of making cool of white supremacy over the internet. I think there are significant changes over before, and I think if Biden gets in power and immediately, for example, opens the borders to several Muslim countries that were banned from entering America for no good reason, recognizes trans rights, etc. I think that is a strong cultural kind of battle with his predecessor, i.e. Trump. But I don't think we have time to get into this. I don't want to outright flatten your point, but I think there are certainly strong kind of conflicts going on culturally today, and the kind of a whole fashion around white supremacy and racism that hasn't really ever been there. As a popular culture, as a mainstream popular culture fashion, or something that's acceptable, in the mainstream. Maybe
then
I'm
again,
wrong.
wouldn't that just be a resurrection of what was previously there? Because all those things you mentioned, the racism, the sexism, that is sort of a recycling of, to an extent, 50s nostalgia.
Yeah, but I think I was kind of saying earlier that it is a recycling that people say is just as effective and just as real now as it was then. Whereas any recycling of a kind of left field culture, people say, oh, it's lost all its power because it's been co-opted. But a recycling of fascism, and people believe it's very real, even if it's like exactly as you're saying, a rehashing. It's the same thing again, but no one's doubting its power, or its, unless you're saying
the
that it's
simulacrum
simply,
is the real.
yeah, but that's true. But then that's just the only thing I was doubting. Then is why, if the simulacrum is a real, people saying that the simulacrum of everything we used to like is non-functioning. It's only the simulacrum of all the stuff we hated that we give power to. But anyway, we'll go back round in circles. But yeah, I get your point.
Well, I think as a bridge between both of you, because I partially agree with both of you, and I think, of course, is that, you know, we don't want a return of old left ideas necessarily. You know, that's what makes it harder for the left to do things, is that if we're really doing something, we're trying to do something new. The right can resurrect old forms and, you know, continue to go. That's not a concern to them. They're not trying to create something new. They are trying to install older forms of hierarchies back onto us. So it's working both ways.
Yeah, but but you say the left don't want to return. I quite agree, but I think we need something entirely new. Whether there is a portion of the left on the online left, and actually, many of our friends who actually do want precisely a return to something very old that has never really functioned. I like some kind of Marxist communism, or not even Marxist. I suppose post-Marxist Leninist communism that never really functioned in its own time, and people were like, can we resurrect that, or can we just try that again? And people who would never want to actually go and like make a revolution, because there's just, you know,
well, there's that
the whole thing reading books,
realism, right, about the recycling of old debates, Kronstadt, and you sort of
but I think Fisher found quite funny people who just thought we could start a communist revolution. I think he as funny as he found anarchists, that it's just completely impractical. But there is a portion of the left that will kind of hate us for saying this.
Well, they look how they reacted to David Harvey, who said how, like, what a revolution right now would result in terms of starvation, because of like like the entire way we structure food production right now is totally dependent on the global neoliberal order. So that's something that can't just be like undone in very fast without massive amounts of starvation.
Yeah, I didn't know he said that, but what did people say?
Well, people reacted really negatively. They were saying he was like counter-revolutionary and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to kind of say anything contrary to just like, let's have a revolution. But I think we're gonna have to wrap up here. So we'll be back soon with another edition, looking at the next chapters of Ghost of My Life. And thank you to the viewers. Please follow us on Facebook and Insta. We're also on Twitch, so please subscribe there. And we have a Patreon, which you can get loads of free stuff on. So please look at that. Okay, thank you very much, and goodbye.